All right. As I was saying, I was kind of going over some of the crews, and to me, in terms of who was up on the mountain, there's really four groups. There's the Sherpas. Um, there's the guides that can kind of be split into a subgroup, but among the climbers themselves, there's really two distinct groups. There's ones that are probably pretty close that they could, obviously with the help of Sherpas, but could kind of go up the mountain by themselves or are really pretty close to being able to make Everest without guides. And then the second group is people that are very good mountain climbers, but are maybe just not quite up to that status. It's very, very hard to get to the top of Everest. Um, and those were the ones that really more heavily relied upon the guides. And actually, a number from that group dropped out before they even reached the top of Everest. And unfortunately, tragedy struck when maybe some of those groups pushed themselves too hard in order to make it all the way up to the top. Um, I would put like John Krakauer, the author of Into Thin Air, as well as Adams. I think he's somewhere on here in that group. Martin Adams. Um, people like Charlotte Fox and Tim Madsen were very good. The real problem with them is that they got sick. This is part of Scott Fisher's crew, part of Mountain Madness. The problem is that they had altitude problems acclimatizing lower on the mountain before they got to the top of the mountain. So really, they'd probably be of equal status if they hadn't had those problems previously. It's a very random kind of when altitude sickness strikes, and it can certainly strike anybody. Now, of course, the more experience you have, both long term and the more time you have on the mountain short term, your chances of altitude sickness, acute, I think they call it like HARP, acute altitude sickness, specifically having to do with, um, you know, oxygen not getting to your brain or oxygen not getting to your lungs, like pulmonary altitude problem, are much less. Now, I said that there's a couple different groups among the guides, among the pros and kind of the, not quite so pros. The one that really stood out and was particularly mentioned in the climb, as per the book, but as per also mentioned into thin air for his overall climbing ability, if not his ability as a guide, was Anatoli uh, Boukreev. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Who was really the Tiger Woods of poker? Matter of fact, or Tiger Woods of poker, Tiger Woods of mountain climbing. Uh, and in fact, was so good that he insisted that he not use bottled oxygen up towards the top of the mountain. Um, Something key about these expeditions, and another kind of way that you can stratify or divide, is uh, kind of on their own when they're ascending. There are the truly elites that don't need bottled oxygen to get up to the top, Anatoly being one of them. But the vast majority of guides, I think maybe like Rob Hall did it too, at least once in his life previous to this expedition where he didn't use bottled oxygen to get up to the top of Everest. But the majority of people have to use bottled oxygen. The air is just too thin. You need to get O2 into your bloodstream so that you don't, it's almost like, you know, you just lose all cognitive or most of your cognitive senses unless you're just particularly trained to be able to do something like this. So O2 is very important, particularly for the clients. They needed O2. Um, so we can start talking about like going up the mountain, as I said. Um, it started in base camp. Now this is where you get the drama with some of the other expeditions, specifically the Johannesburg expedition, which didn't really play a major part in the disaster towards the top of the mountain, but maybe was just an inauspicious start to the whole expedition. These groups were climbing around the same time period. Their date for reaching the top of Everest wasn't all the same, but was because, it takes weeks or, a week or so to actually make the climb, or 4 or 5 days to make the climb. But then there's just a lot of kind of getting everything prepared, getting your clients up there, all that kind of stuff. It takes a while. So the Johannesburg expedition was actually a fraud expedition. The leader, Ian Woodall, lied about his credentials in terms of leading people to the top of various mountains during various time periods. He lied about his experience in the South African military, specifically in the war with Namibia. He was essentially kind of did a little bit of field work, but was mostly a desk jockey, whereas he proclaimed himself kind of one of these elite, kind of like the equivalent of like a Navy SEALs type position, which he was not. And it was particularly sad because this being 1996, it was shortly after apartheid, and this was going to be sort of like a goodwill. I'm going to take this jacket off. Sort of like a goodwill tour of showing the world the new South Africa and what they can really become. But ultimately, because there was all that goodwill put out there, they didn't screen the process as much as they should have. So that expedition, I believe they got up to like the second base camp with a limited number of people, but I don't believe anyone ever actually made it to the top. And when they were climbing, they actually climbed a little bit later than Mountain Madness or Adventure Consultants. The other group that did more prominently play into the tragedy near the top was the Taiwan National Expedition. There was no fraud there, but essentially it was a crew that was not prepared. These being, I believe, largely people that had climbed in the, 15,000, 12,000, well, not 15,000 feet, but maybe like 12,000 foot range around in Taiwan. Previously, they had climbed Mount McKinley or Denali in Alaska, but actually needed the U.S. Coast Guard to come in with a rescue expedition to get them out, foreshadowing a later event. I believe I already mentioned that the leader was Gao Ming Ho. So, on their way up, you start at base camp and you work kind of day in, day out to get acclimatized, go a little bit higher, get a little bit lower. I'm going to reference the climb at this point because there was also, here we go. There was also sort of a chronology of the climb, at least for the Mountain Madness crew with Scott Fisher. One of the things that Anatoli really emphasized, but like was not taken on by Scott Fisher, there was some tension in terms of the way things were to be done between those two crews. Was that once the clients got to base camp, they needed to make a trip lower than base camp before they made their true ascent. This is sort of like a recovery period. The higher you get, the more stress it is. You go down, it's lower stress, but eventually kind of through this wave pattern, you eventually get to the top of Everest. So Scott said no to that, even though Anatoli personally undertook it. The Adventure Consultants crew largely just stayed at base camp and kind of relied upon acclimatization towards camps 1, 2, and 3, I believe, in the weeks prior to the days prior to their true ascent. A contrast between the two groups should be mentioned also, in that Adventure Consultants was much more the conservative, the Rob Hall group was much more conservative mindset in terms of allowing their clients to make decisions. Now, this is particularly smart considering I think Adventure Consultants probably took on a slightly lower quality, slightly lower quality of clients. Many of them were in their 50s, late 40s, 50s. They were in tremendous shape for somebody that age, but were maybe just not at the peak of their climbing ability. Um, and so the way that Rob Hall essentially described it was that when shit hits the fan, if you will, you want your clients to defer to the people that have experience because they're the ones that can truly lead you out of the woods, if you will. This is in comparison to Scott Fisher, who thought that the client should be much more independent. Now, this isn't necessarily just a criticism of Scott Fisher, because a lot of times there's kind of a mad scramble if things go bad on the mountain, and it can be at times very important for clients to make independent-minded decisions. But at the same time, those independent-minded decisions can lead to mistakes. So it's sort of like, do we all pack together and just follow the leader, or do we more kind of spread out on the mountain and let clients make individual choices? So going up the mountain, the first thing that they really went through was the Khumbu, Khumbu icefall. This might actually be, even though it's not a high elevation thing, the most technically challenging part of the whole Everest climb. Specifically because there's this glacier, and in the upper part of the glacier, I think it's called the Western Squim or something, or the Lhotse Face Glacier. Once you get above the ice fall, you can just essentially walk on snow. It's like, fairly even plated snow. But when it gets to the ice fall, it kind of falls over a lip, and then you get these big kind of chunks of ice and crevasses that you can fall down. It's one of the most deadly parts of Everest, even though on the trek up to the top of Everest, it's actually the lowest in elevation. But every year, a different crew sets up the ladders, and the ladders essentially act as bridges, like these vertical ladders, or these horizontal ladders like this, and then also some vertical ladders to get up the ice. The ladders like this cross over like crevasses and stuff. So they all got through that. At that point, some of the clients started feeling, as I mentioned earlier, the effects of the altitude. Not on the first attempt across the ice fall, but that's also when you started seeing a couple clients smartly drop out because they feel they couldn't really do it anymore. Specifically, Pete and Cleve Schoenberg. I believe Cleve Schoenberg is the older of the Schoenbergs, and was actually famous for a rescue on K2, where he essentially saved the lives of almost his entire crew, and they were ultimately able to get down and only lose one client who was probably gone anyway. But that's another story. So he dropped out. His son, Pete, was still there. I believe some of the other people dropped out. Maybe like Dale Cruz, who had like some heart palpitation problems. A lot of them dropped out kind of a little bit higher up the mountain. Maybe Nancy Hutchinson dropped out fairly early, I believe. But once they get up to Camp 2, Camp 3, it's kind of a gradual ascent of this glacier. But that's Camp 2. By the time they get to Camp 3, they're starting the vertical ascent. That's when the ropes need to be down. That's when, really the steep ascent starts. Let's see. We got the Yellow Band and the Geneva Spur. That essentially is different areas along the way that are like a rock scree. And I forget what the Geneva Spur is, but I think it's just like a promenation that you're able to look up. But really, the action starts to get going at Camp 4. This is the Southern Call. It's described about the size of 2 football fields of flat land. Almost all this area is on a slant. So the southern col is a flat area of about football fields in the shape of a polygon. Um, and this really becomes kind of one of the key spots for the expedition, for the tragedy. Uh, it's just sort of the last large flat area where you can have a true camp before you make your final ascent towards Everest. Um, Now, it should be mentioned there is the first death during this time period. One of the people of the Taiwanese expedition essentially got HAPE, I believe, high altitude pulmonary something, so badly that even though they were able to move him down, they didn't move him down right away. He might have been saved if they moved him down quicker. But they moved him down, and they moved him down from Camp 3 to Camp 2 to base camp to Kathmandu to essentially the lowest elevation possible with the most advanced techniques in treating this possible. But essentially his lungs filled up with blood and he unfortunately passed away. I think there was one other death that might have happened kind of lower on the mountain. But in any case, now you got the groups on Camp 3. And really, it's the two groups and then the Taiwanese expedition that has largely just been the auxiliary support staff for the Taiwanese expedition as well as their head leader. A lot of the other people had kind of dropped out either with the tragedy or, just for whatever, because they were incompetent for whatever reason. So, they head out on, I believe it's May 28th, I believe. Oh no, it's right here. I think it should say. Yeah, they start out on, oh no, it's much earlier. It's May 6th. They start out from base camp, spend a couple days in Camp 2. Is it Camp 4? Yeah. Go to Camp 3, then go to Camp 4. This is really both the crews. They kind of ascended simultaneously. And really they're sort of, even though the leadership is taking like two different sides, they're really kind of merging. They know one another, they're interacting, they're using each other's ropes, etc., etc., etc. But after they leave Camp 4, that's when kind of the mistakes are starting to be made in their ascent towards Everest. The first one I really feel is Sandy Pittman. She was a sort of debutante, a very good mountain climber, but sort of a New York socialite debutante type that insisted on using newfangled satellite phone technology to communicate back with New York and we'd say nowadays blogs, but I'm not even sure it was a blog then, but essentially give a daily diary account of what was happening on her ascent of Everest. Now that really wasn't so bad at lower elevations, but the thing that really got her in trouble, and really got the whole expedition in trouble, was kind of related. One of the head Sherpas for, I believe it is Mountain Madness, I believe it's Lobsang Jangbu. Again, this is the auxiliary support staff. This was the first expedition that of the year that was going to try, or that would had the potential to make it towards the top of Everest. There was a Montenegrin crew that had set up some ropes, but had turned back south of the summit to a degree in order to, just because the weather was bad, and they made the smart decision to turn around. This Sherpa was in charge of setting the ropes for the higher expedition, higher elevations in the expedition. But Sandy Pittman personally took him aside and had him, I believe it's called short roping, her most of the way up the mountain. Which is essentially, short roping is like I attach a short rope to a fellow person and then help guide them up. Well, the real problem with this is that it led to delays when they had to set the ropes when clients were already high on the mountain. Let me see here. We'll check this one more time. Yeah. So, there were delays. They had to reset the ropes. I really want to know what like the very top area is. Let me see here. I believe it's called the balcony in the southeast ridge. So around the balcony in particular. No, it wasn't around the balcony. It was around, because the balcony is a small kind of rendezvous area, much smaller than the southern col, where they had put O2 oxygen. The Hillary Steps, named after Edmund Hillary, are, I think they're maybe like 20 to maybe more like 40-foot vertical ascent, which would be no problem for the most basic of rock climbers. The problem is that it's at 28,000 feet in elevation. Now, to get the expedition there on time, they really needed those ropes in before, and just because of miscommunication, but also some of it falls on Sandy Pittman, those ropes were not set up, and people were having to wait at this high elevation as the day kind of progressed. Something else that's very important. You can only climb Everest during the day. And you can kind of start out very early, say like 4 or 5 or something. But if you're caught exposed on the mountain and not in your tent, in your, heavy tent to keep out the elements, etc., 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 you're probably going to pass away. You just cannot be up there at night. It's just, it can't be done. So the delays during the day cause a lot of problems. Well, what happens after they reach the top, the summit? Some get up there very quickly. Jack Krakauer is one of the first people. The delays were not only by the ropes not being set, it was also because of the quality of the clientele. Some clients moved slower. Those were the ones that were really in big trouble. The ones that were able to move up the mountain quicker, kind of on their own accord, were the ones that really were able to get down to base camp and survived, or at least didn't have to go through. I mean, everyone went through hardships, but didn't go through as much hardships as the slower clients. Another big thing that was really kind of the biggest problem in the whole expedition was the turnaround time. And part of this is the unregulated nature and the competitive nature of these two groups. It's a black eye if somebody pays $60,000 to go, that's a lot of money, to go to the top of Everest in one of these guides, and they can't get you up there. Now, if it had only been one crew, maybe they could have said, well, it's unfortunate, but we see it's late in the day, we need to get you back down. But because of this competition between Rob and Scott, there was no, to give it away a little bit, the sad ending away a little bit, they weren't able to interview either of them afterwards. But it was thought that maybe they pushed their clients a little too far in order to get them up to the top so that they could have a better reputation than their competitor. So they didn't turn around fast enough, and really the controversy between these two books, between the accounts of these two books, is what happens next, and it involves Anatoli. And I am going to tell you that in the next part of the review.